hope every one of you behind your screens or in this arena can feel this level of happiness just one time in your life.
Oliveira also has had really two problems in his career. Trouble making weight, problems dealing with adversity. When a fight gets going hard, when a fight gets tough, and there's a way out, he has found that way out before.
And I also started thinking about those decisions, like, oh man, if I had won that decision, where would I be in my career, right? And then I stopped myself and I go, that's the problem right there. I've been thinking like a peasant this whole time. How about if I ended those losers, if I baptized them and send them off to the shadow realm, what would happen then?
In the world of the UFC, it's very easy to write off a fighter as washed up or finished. Sometimes this turns out to be true, but other times, those ideas are proven wrong. Over the years, we've seen a number of UFC fighters who enjoyed a surprising career resurgence, some even claiming titles in the process. Let's take a look at the 5 best revivals we've seen in the UFC. Starting with the man that fought this weekend, we got the stylebender Israel Adesanya. A dominant kickboxer at Glory, Izzy shot up the UFC ranks as a striking phenom in the middleweight division. Nobody could touch him on the feet. He breezed through his competition on his way to fight the greatest middleweight ever and one of the greatest fighters to ever set foot in the UFC, Anderson Silva. Adesanya outclassed the aging superstar, and it looked to be the passing of the middleweight crown. Within a year of fighting in the UFC, Izzy was granted an interim title fight against Kelvin Gastelum, and he showed that he was the best middleweight on the planet. Putting on a show in an absolute bloodbath in the main event of a pay-per-view, it proved exactly what all of us thought was going to happen when Adesanya came to the UFC.
Israel's flashy, Israel's a good-looking kid, Israel speaks really well. Israel became a star tonight, okay? Israel Adesanya became a star tonight.
Adesanya became a star, and it was only a matter of time before Izzy would knock out Robert Whittaker in front of 50,000 fans and prove to the world that he is the guy at 185. For the next 3 years, nobody could stop the stylebender at middleweight. He ran through the top 5 and was going to go through the rankings a second time. Then there came a new contender, someone that Adesanya was familiar with, and someone that looked to be the only match for Izzy. Alex Teixeira had just made his move to MMA from the same kickboxing organization that Izzy came from, and they had their 2 matchups in Glory, where Poatan showed he was the better fighter.
He's gonna be at some pub, talking some I beat that guy one time, trying to get sucked from a crack.
Izzy's talking smack about Teixeira, and Teixeira says, you know what? I want to beat you a 3rd time. They get matched up against each other for the 3rd time at UFC 281, where Izzy was up 3-1 in the fight going into the 5th round. Then, Adesanya's life turns upside down. Alex Teixeira gets the knockout in the 5th round, and for the 3rd time, Adesanya gets beat by his longtime rival. Izzy doesn't know where to go from here, as he's always been thought of as the champ at 185. Maybe this is the downfall of Adesanya. Adesanya vows to come back even better, but fans are curious on how that's going to happen. He's getting his rematch against a guy that blows up to 225 pounds on fight night, who seems to be a better striker than him, and not to mention, has already lost to him 3 times. They're booked to fight again at UFC 287, but there's a different look to Izzy this time around. It looked like Izzy knew he could lose, knew this fight was going to be his hardest test yet, and knew that if he was going to get his career back on track, he needed to finish this fight. Adesanya baits Teixeira into throwing recklessly and catches him with an overhand right, followed by another right, then a left hand that sits Teixeira down, and one last right on the way down to put Poatan out for good. We're treated to the greatest post-match celebration that I've ever seen in any sport, when Adesanya shot 3 arrows at an unconscious Alex Teixeira. And just like that, Izzy was back as the king of the middleweights, and was back to beating the next contenders. Teixeira made a permanent move to 205, and the stylebender had the 185 belt wrapped around his waist. Izzy had revived his career, and looked like there were more people on his radar that he would have to take down. Unfortunately for him, he was flat-footed against Sean Strickland and lost the belt, and in a fight that he was winning against Dricus du Plessis, he would make one mistake and lose his 2nd straight title fight. But hey, maybe he can make a 2nd revival after this weekend. You never know. The next guy that revived his career is Adesanya's teammate at City Kickboxing, Dan Hooker. Dan Hooker has been in the UFC since 2014, and he's always been a whatever kind of fighter. Starting his UFC career 3-3 at featherweight, Hooker would make his move up to lightweight and finish his next 4 opponents, including Gilbert Burns. He'd lose against Edson Barbosa, then win his next 3 after that. Dan won 7 out of 8 fights, and it was time for him to face a step up in competition. Meet Dustin Poirier, a guy who just lost a title fight to Khabib, arguably the greatest lightweight ever. This is Dan Hooker's time to make that next jump, and if there were 10 more seconds in round 2 of that fight, we would have seen Dan Hooker fight for a title. But instead, both of these guys wanted to see how many years they can take off each other's lives in the best fight of 2020, and nobody's beating Dustin Poirier at that. Dan Hooker took the loss, and it looked like his peak was gatekeeper of the lightweight division. Hooker was responsible for Michael Chandler's rise in the UFC, Islam Makhachev's rise to the title, and Arnold Allen's rise in this featherweight division, losing to all of these guys in his next 4 fights. Then, after the Arnold Allen fight, we saw something different that only his CKB teammates knew.
Absolute psychopath. Yeah, he completely put it on today. He made me step up. So, yeah, everyone made me step up. Damn.
Hooker would fight against Claudio Puelles, a knee bar specialist. He told his teammates,
"If this guy gets to my legs and he cranks," Dan made an agreement with himself to just let it go. Like, okay, he's gonna break my legs, cool.
a psycho at his finest, and fortunately for us, he would knock Puelles out in the second round. He would then be put up against Jalen Turner, a similar fight style to Hooker. The fight was close, but Hooker pulled out the split decision, winning his second straight fight. Then, if we couldn't imagine that Dan Hooker could get even crazier than he already is, we saw him come out against Mateus Gamrot. Dan Hooker, after having no tattoos up to this point, is now fully tatted up from head to toe, with skulls and swords and knives all over his body. Dan Hooker would show the psychopath that he is and win the fight, having a face puffed up full of blood. Dan would call everybody and their mom out to a fight, and that's what he did after this big win that got him into the top 5. So Dan Hooker turning into a psychopath absolutely revived his career. And hopefully we get to see more of this guy, because he is absolutely sick in the head, and he's fun as hell to watch. Shout out to the Hangman. The next guy on this list is Jorge Masvidal. Masvidal got known in the fight business from the legendary street fighter, Kimbo Slice. Kimbo wanted to get somebody else to be the main attraction of these fights, and that's where Masvidal came in. Masvidal transitioned to MMA at 19 years old, and would get into the UFC 10 years later. His career was very up and down at this point. He'd get wins, then lose, win again, lose again, and this pattern just kept on going for a couple years. But in 2017, after a decision loss to Stephen Thompson, Masvidal realized something.
And I also started thinking about those decisions, like, oh man, if I had won that decision, where would I be in my career, right? And then I stopped myself and I go, that's the problem right there. I've been thinking like a peasant this whole time. How about if I ended those dudes, if I baptized them and send them off to the shadow realm, what would happen then?
Masvidal has the most split decision losses in UFC, and says to himself, what if a couple of those losses went a different way? Masvidal took a well-needed year and a half off from fighting, went on a reality TV show, and came back in 2019 to fight an up-and-comer at the time, Darren Till, in his home country. He thought about those decision losses and said, screw that, I'm not going to a decision. He knocked Till out cold in the second round. Not only did he do that night, he gave Leon Edwards the infamous
give him the 3-piece with the soda, and then just glide out of there.
Whooping 2 Brits on one night. This turned Masvidal into a star after being known as a gatekeeper in the UFC. And what do stars do exactly?
The fight clock is brought to you by Mo.
They do stuff like that, getting the fastest knockout in UFC history. Masvidal equals bona fide superstar in the MMA world. He was so much of a star that the UFC created a belt after him, titled the BMF. So after an underwhelming UFC career, Masvidal took some time off to have a career resurgence. And that's exactly what happened. He would lose his next 4 fights, 2 of them being for the title, but he was always an entertaining fighter to watch. The 4th guy on this list is the former lightweight champ, Charles do Bronx Oliveira. Oliveira came into the UFC in 2010, and he was known as a jiu-jitsu specialist with no sense of striking. He started 14-0, heading into a bout with the legend Jim Miller, but then came a run of wins and losses that put him in no man's land. Oliveira couldn't establish his footing as a lightweight, so he moved down to featherweight and strung together 4 straight wins, with 3 of them being submissions. Charles finally got his big break, going against Max Holloway in what seems to be the #1 contender fight for the featherweight title. The fight starts, and it's going normal. Charles shoots for a takedown, Holloway stuffs it. Normal, right? Oliveira gets up and doesn't start fighting right away. He instead grabs his shoulder, holding his arm up to Holloway saying, "Hey, I'm done." Not what you see out of a fighter. Charles is looked at as a quitter, like he doesn't have the mindset of a fighter. Oliveira would lose 3 of his next 5, and there was no direction to the title for him. He's been in the UFC 7 years now, and it doesn't look good for him at this point. Then, all of a sudden, a switch flipped for Oliveira. Charles would move back to lightweight and said, "Forget this, I'm going all in." DuBronx would submit his next 4 opponents, knock out the next 2 after that, and then submit Kevin Lee to get 7 straight finishes in the stacked lightweight division. It should have been 8, to be honest, but Tony Ferguson is a psycho that didn't want to tap to the armbar that Charles Oliveira had. Oliveira got a title fight against Michael Chandler to see who would take over the lightweight division after Khabib. But this high stake of a fight didn't affect with how Oliveira has been fighting, standing toe-to-toe with the steroid freak that Chandler is. Oliveira knocked him out in the second, taking the lightweight title that he deserved after 11 years in the UFC. A guy known as a quitter, gatekeeper, or journeyman revived his career and got himself a UFC belt. Not only a belt, got himself a belt in the most stacked division in the UFC, and defended it twice against the most dangerous guys in lightweight history. Now that's what I like to call a career revival. The last guy I want to talk about is Glover Teixeira. Glover made his UFC debut in 2012 and made a name for himself right from the jump, winning 5 straight fights, a couple of those being against Rampage Jackson and Ryan Bader. Teixeira got a title shot against John Jones, who was building his resume as the UFC GOAT at the time. Jones dominated him, doing whatever he felt like doing in the fight, and there was a clear skill gap between the champ and Teixeira. Teixeira would lose his next fight, win the next 3, and then alternate between wins and losses for the next 3 years. It's 2019, and Glover is 39 years old at this point. It looks like he just likes to fight, and likes to get a nice paycheck with it. The UFC start to match him with light heavyweights that they think could make that next step. Guys like Karl Roberson, Ian Cutelaba, Nikita Krylov, guys who are trying to build their name in the UFC. Glover can easily just take it light against these guys and let them get a decision win against him. But no, Glover still believes he can make a run for the title. He submits Roberson and Cutelaba, beats Nikita Krylov, knocks out Anthony Smith, and submits Thiago Santos all in a 2-year span to get a title shot against Jan Blachowicz. John Jones didn't exist amongst the light heavyweights anymore, and this is Glover's shot to gain what he's been after for the past 9 years. And in a shocking turn of events, Glover submits Jan to win himself the light heavyweight title at the ripe age of 41 years old, being the oldest UFC champ ever. From being seen as a stepping stone for the other light heavyweights in the UFC, to being the pinnacle of the light heavyweights that these guys look up to. Glover had a complete career resurgence, and it'll hopefully put him in the Hall of Fame at some point. From a long-time rivalry, to turning into a psychopath, to going on a reality TV show, or to just saying, "I'm turning it up now." All of these guys have revived their careers in their own way. Let me know what you guys think about this video in the comments. All that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you guys later.